Since the inauguration, Donald Trump has flipped on a couple of his most publicized, clearest economic positions, things that he was likely to do were he to become president. For instance, he repeatedly said that he would label China a currency manipulator once he becomes president. In the past week, he's announced that he's not going to do that, saying the reason is that he needs China's help to deal with North Korea. Okay, perhaps. Also, he repeatedly said that he was likely to remove effectively the tax break for so-called carried interest for a certain class of people working in Wall Street. And he hasn't said that he's not going to do that, but he's taken effectively no action. And we're nearing the 100-day point in his presidency so far. So why is it that on these issues he seems to be diverging so far from campaign Donald Trump? Well, it might be that he's surrounded himself with the sorts of billionaires that'll push you in the direction of maintaining policies that they currently benefit from. One of those billionaires is Steve Schwarzman, head of the Blackstone private equity group. Now I know, David, you have an article coming out specifically about some of the positions he's staked out on those particular issues too, and his business connections with China, the number of different industries he has there. So what do you think about him potentially serving as more and more of an unofficial advisor to Donald Trump on these sorts of policies? Is it likely that Donald Trump will exercise any autonomy when it comes to these issues? Where else might his influence be seen?
Well, first of all, it's not unofficial, it's official. Steve Schwarzman is...
Well, he's not an actual government employee.
That's right.
Which is consequential when it comes to ethics rules.
Yes, so basically Steve Schwarzman was appointed to run the White House, a White House council, an official White House council that advises Trump on economic policies. Trump says he speaks frequently with Steve Schwarzman, who is the billionaire CEO of Blackstone, the world's largest private equity firm. By being a chairman of a White House panel, but also saying I'm not a full-time White House employee, the Trump administration is interpreting this to mean that Steve Schwarzman, the CEO of Blackstone, is not subject to conflict of interest laws, is not subject to rules that would force him to divest from his company. And so he is effectively advising Trump and sculpting White House policy on various policies that Blackstone is currently investing in. You mentioned a couple. I mean, you mentioned the currency manipulation. Blackstone in its own SEC filings says that it has an interest in those policies. Carried interest, I mean, carried interest is a tax benefit for private equity executives like Steve Schwarzman. Blackstone is also...
to the tune of millions of dollars per year, theoretically.
There was a report that said that Steve Schwarzman, if they closed that loophole and forced him to pay the income tax rates that regular people pay, you have to pay about $8 million more a year in income taxes, which for him is not that much. But it gets even more intense, which is that Trump moved, for instance, to repeal the so-called fiduciary rule, the rule that would say that financial advisors have to keep their clients' best interests, prioritize their clients' best interests. Blackstone has a vested interest in that rule not going forward, because that rule makes it much harder for Blackstone to access the multi-trillion-dollar world of 401ks and IRAs. Schwarzman has said it is our dream to get into that multi-trillion-dollar retail business, and our article, which is now up at ibtimes.com, details how the fiduciary rule makes it much harder for them to get involved in that. Same thing with the infrastructure bill. Trump has floated an infrastructure with concepts that would essentially move infrastructure money through Wall Street intermediaries to allow Wall Street to manage the building of public assets. Guess what? Blackstone has recently said it wants to expand into investing in infrastructure. Same thing with drilling. Blackstone has been investing in offshore drilling, distressed offshore drilling companies as a private equity firm at the very same time that Trump is moving forward with rules and legislative proposals to expand offshore drilling. So essentially what you have, I mean, this is a really naked example of this, where you have literally the person who is in Donald Trump's ear advising him on economic policy, a guy who at the White House said, cabinet secretaries are presenting their ideas to me. He just said that him and his counsel. This same person runs the biggest private equity firm in the world that is literally investing in the very same areas and businesses that Trump's new policies affect and shape.
Okay, so let me go even a little further. So he is, as David's been telling you, he's the chair of Trump's Strategic and Policy Forum. That means that Trump is turning to him for policy and strategy on these economic issues. So and by his own admission, according to the SEC filings, he's saying, look, if they raise tariffs on China, we're going to lose a tremendous amount of money. And we know for a fact, not only David's reporting, Politico's reporting, inside officials at the White House saying, the Schwartzman saying, don't raise tariffs on China. Yeah. And Trump is listening to him.
And Blackstone has put out public statements specifically on those issues.
Also publicly said carried interest would cost us a tremendous amount of money if you took that tax privilege away from them. Number two, they said that in public that it would adversely affect their ability to recruit, retain, and motivate their talent. Yeah, because I mean, if we only pay our mid-level executives $11 million instead of $12 million a year, I do declare, where will we find talent?
Might as well just drive a taxi at that point.
Yeah. So that gets us to who is Donald Trump. So because on the campaign trail, he said over and over again that he would raise the tariffs on China, that they were currency manipulators, and that he would punish them for that, and he would label them as so. Now, did he mean any of it? First of all, a Trump friend and aide, an advisor that is close to him, said, well, he doesn't have deep knowledge of the country. Okay, referring
Which
to China.
Country?
The China. Well, us too, I'm sure. But so, in other words, he didn't know what the hell he's talking about. You know why? Because as I told you during the campaign, all he was doing was A/B testing the crowd. So he would do things like in the beginning, like, I'll tell you what the real problem is? Bangladesh, crickets. Or Botswana, crickets. Or China. I knew it, the real problem is China. That's what the problem is. And what they're doing, well, you know what? We should lower tariffs on them. Crickets, right? We should raise tariffs on them. That's it, that's what I meant, raise tariffs on China. What's China, right? He doesn't know. So when you take the fact that he's completely ignorant by the admission of his own friends and allies, of not only of China, but also economic policy. He just inherited the money. He runs a bunch of golf courses and is near bankruptcy on some of them. Again, he doesn't know anything about business. He went bankrupt 6 different times. You take it with the fact that he's a pathological liar. Again, in another report, one of his closest friends said, look, we know Donald, we like Donald, he's a good guy. He tells one thing and then he says another thing. That's who he is.
Don't take him literal.
Yeah, he's a pathological liar. So is he gonna keep his word to you, the voters? That's a good one. He doesn't keep his word to his best friends, and they already know it. And then finally, he's easily influenced. It says in every report about him, whoever's the last guy in the room, he's like, well, okay, because he has an empty head. If you don't have anything in your head, the last guy in the room wins. And the last guy in the room now is Steve Schwartzman. So he himself, Trump, talked about how, well, Steve was telling me about China. I didn't, and he was telling me all these things I didn't know. Yeah, of course he's telling it to you from his perspective. He's not telling it to you from like, this is what's good for America or American voters. He's saying this is what's good for Blackstone, one of the largest financial institutions in the world. The guys that you ran against, you ran your campaign against. So he's a complete and utter fraud. Of course he's gonna listen to Steve Schwartzman. Steve Schwartzman just in this election cycle gave $5.5 million in legalized bribes to the Republican Party. Of course he's gonna listen to Schwartzman and not you guys.
See, you seem so concerned about him, and I get that, but I want to put you at ease because a Blackstone spokesperson put out a comment, because there's all this news now, saying just as Mr. Schwartzman has assisted presidents from both parties in the past, he has provided his views to President Trump when asked. His only reason for doing so is serving the common good and helping produce positive results for the American people.
Now, to be clear, I was in touch with that spokeswoman.
Oh, really?
I was, yeah, for our story.
Do you feel better now?
Well, I don't feel better now.
Okay.
But they would not offer a comment at all on a very simple question, which was, is Mr. Schwartzman evading federal ethics laws that are designed to say you can't be a recurrent, regular advisor to a president and also keep a financial interest in the business that you're advising him on? I mean, that's to me, that is the key issue here. This is not somebody who happened to have a meeting with the president. This is somebody who is running a White House policy council, who is bragging to the press, saying cabinet secretaries are presenting, that's his word, presenting their ideas to our council. for federal policies. This is a person who is vetting federal policy and running the largest private equity firm in the world.
Yeah.
And this is, by the way, our article only goes over what we know. I mean, imagine there are day-to-day regulatory decisions that are being made that will affect Steve Schwartzman's business all the time. I mean, the SEC a couple of years ago fined his company for charging and not disclosing fees to investors. Essentially, the SEC said you're reducing the value of your own investors' assets to enrich yourself. That was a regulatory, it's an example of a regulatory kind of situation that happens on a day-to-day basis. If you are a regulator evaluating different cases to look at, and you know that way up the food chain, the CEO of this one firm has the ear of the biggest boss in the world, is that going to change your regulatory decisions, especially if you know that CEO is running the company and has that ownership stake in the company?
Well, and look, this is why people need to push on this, because it might be a little bit harder in the case of Steve Schwartzman, but we had a very similar situation with Ivanka Trump just a few weeks ago, where they had made it fairly clear they have no interest in her actually being an official member of the White House. So despite the fact that she's sitting in on meetings with foreign dignitaries and being involved in conversations that have economic effects on her businesses, we pushed back on that. People pushed back on that, and then eventually she had to say that she would comply with the ethics rules. It's possible that that could happen with Steve Schwartzman as well, and incredibly consequential. I mean, with Ivanka Trump, we're talking about possibly her business being affected. They're large sums of money and all that. But with Steve Schwartzman, we're talking about some of the core economic policies of Donald Trump, perhaps being modified specifically because of his interests. He has to comply with those ethics rules.
I mean, I keep going back to the fiduciary rule just for one more second on that, because that, to me, that is such an obvious situation, right? The day that Steve Schwartzman convenes his first White House council meeting in the White House, Trump issues the executive order to delay the fiduciary rule. The fiduciary rule's core regulation is you as a financial advisor must prioritize your client's best interests. And Blackstone has said that that is a threat to its business. So the convergence of that situation in the White House, delaying a fiduciary rule that simply says you have to act in the best interest of your clients, and the company who's the CEO is advising you, is in the White House advising you on economic policy. I mean, that is the most illustrative example of exactly why this is so problematic.
Yeah. So look, the good news here is that this will be Trump's downfall. I don't mean in the actual legal proceedings, et cetera. I just mean in the polls and among his own supporters. Yeah. Because look, when you have a company like Steve Schwartzman, that's company Blackstone, and they use as an excuse, he's advised presidents that are also Democrats. Yeah, I know the Democrats also take legalized bribes. That's what we've been talking about all the time. They say, oh well, Obama also met with the CEO of GE. Yeah, I know. And we talked about it and we said how terrible that was, that is not a neutral person. They have vested interests, right? And that you should be aware of that. Now this is worse because Trump is being directly guided. He made him the chair of this policy and strategy forum. By the way, he's also his neighbor down in West Palm Beach. And right after he met with the Chinese president at Mar-a-Lago, Trump did, Steve Schwartzman came in right afterwards and was like, okay, now here's what you do with the Chinese. Okay, that's also in the Politico story. I mean, they're wedded like this. So, and they also explain that Trump respects wealthy people like himself more than anyone else, okay? The reason he respects them is because, to be fair to Steve Schwartzman, he actually earned it. I mean, it's kind of a funny thing to say when you say publicly, it would hurt our business tremendously if we had to actually care about the best interest of our clients. Which is, what you're doing.
He earned it to the extent that any investment banker earns anything.
That's right. And it's not like Trump, where Trump just got handed hundreds of millions of dollars and has been bungling it his whole life. So that's why he respects them. He's like, wow, they actually made money, unlike me, right? But if you do that and all you do is listen to these guys and then you direct all of your policy that way, guess who's gonna be super pissed? Not in the beginning, right? Because they're like, oh, dear leader Trump, et cetera. But eventually, man, even your own voters are gonna be like, oh, he rebuilt the swamp. Turns out he was just a regular old politician like the rest of them. And what did he do? He brought in all the Goldman Sachs guy, he brought in this guy. And at the end of the day, they're still robbing us and fleecing us. And so, Hear me now, quote me later. He's going into the 20s in the approval rating, okay, because of stuff like this. Young Turks now has over 6 billion lifetime views. You know who did that? You did that. We're now larger than CNN, ABC, you name a news network online, we're larger than them. And you built all that as everyone scoffed and didn't believe. And here we are, guys, thanks to you. Build independent media together with us at tytnetwork.com/join.